Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, commentary, and analysis about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, also at my website, The Voice for Liberty, that's at wichitaliberty.org. You can find also show notes there for each episode, so you can find links to documents and topics that we talk about today. And with me, as always, Karl Peterjohn, formerly of Sedgwick County Commission. Now, Karl, there was some news last week regarding Kansas politics, national politics really, in that our three recognized parties, Democratic, Republican, Libertarian, all had nominating conventions of one sort or another and produced three candidates who are going to run in an election on
April 11th.
That's it, Karl. We usually say November, it seems like, is election.
Well, I know our municipal elections used to be in April, and then April 11th was actually pretty close to one of those dates.
So this will be a full election. There's going to be advance voting and everything. Only one question on the ballot so far. Maybe we'll talk about that. And as a public service, the last day to register to vote is March 21st for this. And listeners should know we have proof of citizen requirements now, and I think most people would accomplish that with a birth certificate, but I think there are other ways to do that as well.
Well, passports I know work too.
Yeah. So, Karl, you were at the Republican nominating convention on Thursday evening out at Friends University, and you filed a report on that. What was it like out there? Because this is an unusual event, after all.
It is a very unusual event, but we may have at least as many as 4 of them across the country, because President Trump has nominated 4 members of the House of Representatives, one from South Carolina, who hasn't been confirmed yet to position in OMB. Secretary Price of HHS is from Georgia and has resigned his position, just like our Congressman Pompeo has. And there's also a congressman from Montana whose nomination is pending. Hasn't been resolved, but under the Constitution, all 4 of these positions have to be voted upon. And so here, Kansas is leading the way on this, because Mike Pompeo was the first one out of the chute. And with his resignation just a few weeks ago, the parties, Republican, Democrat, and Libertarian, all had to select a candidate under the new state law that's been approved for this special election April 11th. And the Republican event, there's been a lot of discussion about how President Trump is doing, but based on the folks who were at this full house, I mean, they packed the auditorium. The enthusiasm was palpable. There were 5 candidates whose names were placed in nomination, received votes on the first round. Because the bottom 2 candidates tied with the fewest number of votes, they were eliminated. That was Mr. Bruce and Mr. Ashby. And the 3 remaining candidates, State Treasurer Ron Estes had gotten the most votes and just needed a handful more, and he won on the second ballot with 66 of the 126 voting delegates. 2 days later, the Democrats and Libertarians made their nomination. Now, Bob, full disclosure, while I did not vote in this event, I am was an alternate for this event, and participated as far as any alternate did. But basically, that just meant I had a really good seat in the gallery.
Well, I think what's interesting, amongst the Republicans, there were 126 delegates, and only 7 alternates had to be seated. That's pretty good attendance, I think.
I think it's excellent. My understanding is there were smaller numbers for both the Democrat and Libertarian nominations, and of course, there's going to be a very short window for these candidates to get out and campaign.
Right.
And you've got I think there were 14 counties in this district extending as far north and west as Stafford, and as far south and east, you've got Greenwood and Elk and Chautauqua, I believe. So,
State Treasurer Ron Estes, we know him and his wife Susan very well. What about the Democrat, James Thompson? Do we know much about him?
Not nearly as much, because his name hasn't been on the ballot. I mean, Ron Estes had been the county treasurer, had been elected and re-elected to that position, so he was a fairly familiar figure to Sedgwick County voters, at least, when he was overwhelmingly elected state treasurer in 2010. beat the Democrat incumbent, Dennis McKinney, who was also a candidate for the Democrat nomination, but like you said, he fell by the wayside to Mr. Thompson.
And what's interesting is the Libertarians nominated a man named Chris Rockhold, I believe is the name, someone who's only been in Wichita a couple years. He came to Wichita to be a flight instructor at Flight Safety or one of these companies, so really not much known about him either.
Well, third parties, I think, struggle often in terms of finding strong candidates, although I believe there were 3 Libertarians seeking the nomination, and there will be at least those 3 names will be on the ballot come April 11th.
Yeah. So probably before long we'll start to see all sorts of traditional campaigning, yard signs, mailers, TV, radio commercials, and everything. Again, that's going to be April 11th. Register to vote by March 21st, and you can have a say in who our next congressman will be.
I think it's going to be an important vote, especially in light of the fact that it's probably going to be the first of several that are occurring around the country.
And I know that they're trying to frame this as a referendum on Donald Trump and maybe even Sam Brown back, but you know, we'll just have to see how that works out.
Well, in 2016, Bob, President Trump carried the state with by about 20 percentage points.
Yeah, and in the 4th district, much more Republican than it has been in the past when we did have a Democrat represent us in Congress. So let's take a moment off for a commercial break. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl Peterjohn. So Karl, up in Topeka, we've got some action going on. There's been a bill actually passed in the House of Representatives to raise taxes. But before we talk about that, if we back up a little bit, we remember that in 2012 we voted to reduce taxes. We didn't vote to reduce spending, and that's been a mounting problem. But for the first 2 years after tax cuts, I've got the figures right here, and they'll be at wichitaliberty.org. We spent, I don't want to say deficit spending, but we had a bunch of money in the bank. We spent for 2 years over $300 million each year of that balance. In other words, we spent more than we took in at taxes simply because the legislature did not want to cut spending. Now, when that happens at Washington, they call that stimulus or deficit spending. Is that fair to say that we really did that here in Kansas too?
Well, and we can argue about how much stimulation occurred. Obviously, reducing state taxes, I think, provided some economic stimulation, but you've got to keep in mind, Washington, federal taxes have been raised, and we're talking also federal regulations, and I could make an argument that that's been a bigger problem, Bob, for businesses trying to move forward. The what I like to call Franken-Dodd regulations on small community banks had a terribly negative impact on the local banking community, which has hurt smaller businesses needing financing or trying to handle their finances, whether it's accounts receivable or other mechanisms where they would be using financial tools to go forward.
And it is true that the federal income taxes, the highest brackets are almost 40% now, I think, while in Kansas the highest bracket had been 6.5% or something like that. So
6.45%.
So the effect of federal tax, it's a much bigger lever than we have here in Kansas.
Let me clarify. If it had been 6.45% was the maximum for personal income prior to the Brownback tax reductions, it brought it down under 5%.
So
which actually still leaves us with a fairly high state income tax rate. I remember the big controversy in Illinois when they raised their income tax rates, and it went from 3% to 5%, which is just slightly more than us, but had a very negative impact on Illinois' economy.
And you know, people say, well, it went just from 3 to 5. That's only 2%. But really, the way to look at it is it almost doubled the tax rate.
A 67% increase.
Right. Yeah, that's the way to look at these things. There was a bill this week in the House of Representatives, and just today, on Thursday, the 16th, I think today is, when we're recording, a bill to raise taxes passed by a pretty big majority, less than a veto-proof majority, and the governor says he will veto that bill. So that's got to move into the Senate now, but by all indications, it looks like the state of Kansas legislature is much more willing to raise taxes than cut spending as a way to make a balanced budget.
Well, the elections have consequences, Bob, and there were big taxing candidates from both parties who managed to get through. On the Republican side, got through the primary. On the general election, got through the general election side. And if you've got somewhere between 75 to 85 House members who are willing to vote for higher taxes, 84 is the magic number for 2/3 of the Kansas House. And so 42 votes are needed to sustain the governor's veto. And Governor Brownback has been quite clear. The negative impact of raising income taxes on, let's say, a family of 4 that's making just a little over $30,000 a year, they're going to have to start paying much higher income taxes under this proposal that's passed the Kansas House. And I think when people realize how significant this income tax increase is going to be, I think there's going to be a lot of negative reaction.
You know, there's the people who are in favor of more taxes say we've got to fix the Kansas economy. It's been wrecked. Now, no doubt there's a problem with the budget. I mean, we've got problems balancing a budget, but that's different than the economy. I ask people, how will raising taxes and having more government spending, how's that going to help put more Kansans back to work and increase income?
Well, I was going to say the states that have the highest income tax rates generally have have more problems with economic growth, generally have out-migration problems. The 9 states—
New York, California, New Jersey, Illinois, some of those?
Well, some of those definitely. In terms of New York and even California, they've got some of the highest marginal income tax rates in the among all 50 states.
And those states, while they're losing people to lower tax states like particularly Texas, I think, but all throughout the Sun Belt, those states are still very wealthy because they've been wealthy in the past, and they have historical things like New York being the financial capital, Wall Street was California was Silicon Valley and the movie industry and things like that. But that's not going to carry them forward forever, is it? I don't think.
Well, the big challenge, Bob, is that if high taxes was the solution to our economic woes, places like Detroit, New York City, Chicago, that have some of the highest taxes at the state, local, and federal level combined, should be the magnets. Instead of actually losing people like they have been, they should be gaining them.
And especially Detroit, you see all the pictures that Detroit was one time, I think, maybe the wealthiest big city in America, but now it's paradoxically, because values are so low in Detroit, it's starting to come back in a little bit, but it's got a way big cliff to jump over again. So, Karl, that's going to be the end of segment 2 here on Wichita Liberty TV. Join us again in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me, Karl Peterjohn. Karl, there's been some issues about Wichita and the surrounding area having to do with the Greater Wichita Partnership. Can you give us just a brief rundown of, that's a new organization, but it's really just a reformulation of a couple others. Can you fill us in on the history of that and what is the Greater Wichita Partnership supposed to be doing?
The Greater Wichita Partnership may be a new organization, but their mission in terms of trying to promote this area and how broadly we define this area we can talk about, but it's basically at least including all of Sedgwick County and primarily focused on Wichita. But this mission has been in place for literally decades, and we've been through different names, but the idea has been trying to provide a focal point for attracting and retaining businesses for this community that will help bring in payroll, employment,
jobs,
and stimulate economic growth in south central Kansas.
And that seems like a good goal, but we've not had a lot of success. I've got a chart here I'll show on wichitaliberty.org that shows that yes, we are growing jobs in Wichita, but at a slower rate than the country is as a whole. In other words, we're actually farther behind.
Actually, the problem has been that our economic growth has, well, at times we've exceeded the national average. we've never exceeded the statewide average, and that's been a key benchmark that I think we should be trying to reach, Bob. And it's a disturbing trend because South Central Kansas has been a leader in a lot of ways, especially in entrepreneurial businesses, if you look at the history of this community.
Sure.
But there haven't been the startups that have grown into the bigger businesses, and they're, you go back to the 19th century and early 20th century, and everything from the aircraft industries and the Coleman Company, just to mention a couple, that and all the oil firms that got originally started here. Pizza Hut's more and Rent-A-Center are more recent, but going back to that, just to mention the history of some of the great entrepreneurial startups here in South Central Kansas.
So they're trying to jumpstart entrepreneurship, I think, but the problem is that these young firms that are very tenuous in their survival, Wichita still pumps millions of dollars of subsidy into our legacy firms, Spirit, Cessna, the big aircraft and manufacturing firms. They are the companies that get all the incentives, and I feel that raises the cost of government for everybody else, especially the young startups that are struggling to make it.
Well, I think the big problem is that when a lot of these companies got started, the tax climate was much more favorable for startups. If you look at the companies, particularly the aircraft ones that got started in the 1920s, there was no state income tax. And after the Mellon reforms at the national level, the federal income tax rates were brought way down from the confiscatory rates that had been in place during and immediately after World War I, when the federal government not only had, I think, close to 80% tax rates for federal income taxes, but they had taken over the telephone, telegraph, shipping, and railroad industries.
So here in Wichita, we've got this Greater Wichita Partnership, and I looked at their website a couple weeks ago, and they have, sliding images touting good things about Wichita, and one was headlined, NetApp doubles its Wichita footprint. Now, NetApp is a high-tech company, the type of company that everybody wants to have, but the problem is, well, first of all, NetApp never doubled its footprint. They said they were going to double their employment, but that was just announcing a plan that was going to take years to implement. But actually, NetApp has been contracting its employment not only in Wichita, but I think worldwide as a company as a whole. Yet we still have the Greater Wichita Partnership promoting NetApp as a Wichita success story.
Well, and full disclosure, at one time, the building where NetApp's located, I had worked out there with another company, NCR. But you're raising the bigger issue of performance for all these efforts to attract, retain, and grow businesses. And this is a case where the company, NetApp, came in here, acquired the property from another firm, and basically set some ambitious objectives, and they haven't met them. And it's one of the problems that the private sector, it's a challenge out there in terms of growing
Sure.
in this difficult economy.
And it's unfortunate that they've not met their plans, and maybe things will turn around, and they will. We can hope for that. But my point is that who is in charge at the Greater Wichita Partnership that they don't even, it's really embarrassing to me to have to look at these websites and see them tout companies that in the past they said, here's Wichita success story, but they're companies that had actually closed their Wichita operations.
Well, the city and county are involved in helping fund this. The county commission just this week approved $300,000 for the Greater Wichita Partnership, and I believe the city will be, if they haven't approved already, will be shortly approving a similar amount. Plus there's private sector funding for the operation. They have their own board, but it's a challenge because it's a public-private entity, and the accountability factor is a real challenge when you have both a public side, public funding, and private.
And that is, I think, the big problem. Who is accountable for this really what I'm going to say is a mess there. Let's take another moment off here on Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and he's Karl Peterjohn. Karl, you know, I hate to keep harping on the city and their efforts like that, but remember, we mentioned briefly last week Activate Wichita. This was something a few years ago, greatly heralded by the city, as this is a way for everybody to get in touch, for us to collaborate together about what we want to do with Wichita, that the elected officials can interact with citizens. But this thing has really been abandoned, the website is. It's old, it's stale, it's ugly, it's just an embarrassment. Yet the city of Wichita still prominently mentions Activate Wichita at the top of each of their web pages. And I mentioned that to the city's public information director 2 or 3 weeks ago. He said he'd look into this, but it's still there.
Government failure, and that's one of the problems. You don't have a direct feedback loop, and if, for instance, the news media, other parts that maybe have a little bit more influence than we enjoy, don't pick this up, don't follow it. The fact that the city's got a zombie website that's supposed to be used for promoting the community that actually is a boat anchor on the community,
really
in my
an embarrassment,
opinion.
I think I'll use that word again. And we have expanded the city's communication staff within the past 2 years, added actually people to that. And related to that, there was a story in the Wichita Eagle this week about a city council member, Pete Meitzner, who offered testimony to a committee in the House, Senate, whatever, it doesn't matter. So I asked the city—
You're talking Topeka, not Washington.
Yes, Topeka, that's right. So I asked the city, could I have that testimony, please? And yes, I got it. They sent it to me, and they didn't charge me anything, you know, because it's just sending a file by email. But the problem is why can't the city make this information available freely? Like last week we talked about the checkbook. The county does it. You don't have to ask for it. You just go there and look. It's there. The city has very little information like that available, yet the city believes it is doing a good job.
Well, I think all the taxpayer-funded entities that particularly are lobbying up in Topeka, and I know locally the county does, City of Wichita does, USD 259, and I think some of the other governmental bodies around here have representatives either directly or indirectly through the Kansas Association of Counties, League of Municipalities, or the Association
or just a
of
contract
School Boards.
lobbyist like the county has.
This testimony should be readily available. Now, if you go up to the legislative committees and are able to pull that information, is kept and recorded. Now, I don't believe it's readily posted anywhere.
Some committees post testimony and other documents pretty easily on the committee's website, at the legislature's website, but many do not.
And I think it should be uniform across the board. I frankly wish we had a state version of C-SPAN so that you could not only see what the legislators are directly doing when they're in session, but also, and I know the rooms are set up so that they can record the committee hearings, because actually that's where a lot of the real legislative work gets done. And Bob, the most important part, and this would be the key, is the conference committees. When you get to the end of the session, now this might be, we're really getting into the weeds, because
at
Carl, 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, you'll have 6 members, 3 from the House and 3 from the Senate, meeting to basically say, okay, the House version of this bill passed, has provisions A, B, and C in it, and the Senate version of the bill has X, Y, and Z, and you know, we've got to put this together and then get both houses to approve it before we can send it to the governor.
And this happens at the federal level, and I think in most states as well. Where
except Nebraska, where they have a unicameral legislature.
If the two chambers have a bill that's on the same topic, but if every word's not the same, they've got to hammer together a compromise. That compromise somehow is called a conference committee report, which sounds like a report. Oh, it's just a report. No, it's a bill. You know, it's the bill. And the other thing is, normally, I believe, Carl, at least in Kansas, those conference committee reports are either, they may be non-debatable and non-amendable, which means that when they go back to the House and to the Senate for passage, it's either up or down. There's no amending one way or the other.
Well, I do think they debate, but you're absolutely right that they cannot amend. The conference committee report can just have an up or down vote.
Because if it could be amended, then you'd have to go back again.
You'd have an even more explicit problem with government legislative confusion.
Yeah, sometimes one body will send it back to the conference committee with instructions to, you know, do something or another. This is really kind of when you get into the sausage making, because these conference committee reports have been used to pull off shenanigans, haven't they?
Big time.
Yeah, big time, and we could probably talk all afternoon about that. But I think the 2012 tax cuts in Kansas was something that was an unintended consequence, at least the way they came out, was an unintended consequence of some sort of shenanigans involving this legislative maneuvering.
Well, we need at least 5 more minutes to go into the details on that one by itself, and frankly, I think we could do a whole program.
Yeah, and it's something that's, like you say, it's really in the weeds, but it's something that's important because that's how our laws get made. And, these laws, like these tax cuts, they do have big consequences on our economy and on people's personal lives.
Well, going back to the 19th century, a German chancellor basically made this statement that one should never watch either sausage or laws being made.
Who was that, like Bismarck or
Bismarck,
something?
yes. Okay. Very good, Bob.
Thought you were going to say maybe it was Hitler or somebody, but
no, 19th century.
He piled up on top of that, I think, anyway. So, well, Karl, look, we're out of time this week. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining us again. Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Remember, check wichitaliberty.org for show notes about today's episode with charts and pictures.